Our first topic today, and the vast majority of this lecture, will be on vertebrate skeletal muscle. And once again, if you skipped the intro part, I'm being a little bit quieter than usual because I'm recording this during nap time. So here we go. We'll start with an introduction to muscles. What is muscle tissue? What is it good for? So muscle is contractile tissue. It's all about movement. The idea is that a motor output is a mechanical force. So it's something that we can use to either move substances within an organism or move the organism itself. More specifically, the functions associated with muscle tissue are locomotion, which is just the organism moving, manipulating the environment. That's what we do when we do things with our hands. Blood circulation, because of course our heart is a muscle, and feeding and peristalsis, so getting food into our body and then moving that food through our body, is also accomplished with muscles. Most of the muscle found in the human body is skeletal muscle, which is sometimes called striated muscle. I prefer the term skeletal muscle because, as we'll see when we look at other types of muscle, there is another type of muscle that has the striated appearance, so it's just more precise to call it skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is so named because these are the big muscles in your body that are attached to and move your skeleton. Skeletal muscles are attached to bones via structures called tendons, which are dense cords of connective tissue. And skeletal muscle is the most abundant tissue in your body. Most of the mass of your body is actually skeletal muscle. The cells of skeletal muscles are called muscle fibers. When you hear the term muscle fiber, that refers to a cell of a skeletal muscle. So in this picture right here, each of these structures, these long cylindrical cells, that is a muscle fiber, that is a single cell. Muscle fibers are multinucleate. So they form when you have many cells arranged in a row and those cells fuse together. They each retain their nuclei though, so you have one long cylindrical cell that has many nuclei. Muscle cells are morphologically very unique. They have a number of distinct features. One of them that we're going to see when we get into the function of muscles is called T-tubules or transverse tubules. These are infoldings of the plasma membrane that do what if we're folding? Right, we're increasing the surface area. So we have these very large diameter cells, but we have the plasma membrane folded inwards here, and it makes little tunnels through the cell. So if you can kind of picture this, if you have this cylinder, you have little tunnels through it caused by folds in the plasma membrane called T-tubules. We also have a highly modified endoplasmic reticulum called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that is also going to come into play when we talk about how muscle contractions work. You can see in this image that the SR, shown in this kind of grayish blue, is closely associated with those T-tubules. That's going to be very important for how these muscles function. Within muscle cells, so we have the muscle, we have muscle fibers, the cells, and then within those cells we have these long filaments called myofibrils. These are these long longitudinal fibers, these structures within muscle cells that are made of two types of filaments. The first are called thin filaments, named because they're thinner than the other one. So the thin filaments have a number of components, and this figure shows the structure of the thin filaments. The thin filaments are primarily made of actin. So each of these little yellow Death Stars, these are the monomers of actin. And associated with that is a structure called tropomyosin, which surrounds it. And that is bound to a regulatory protein called the troponin complex. That troponin complex is going to be very important because that's actually going to regulate when the muscle fiber is active. We'll see later on the importance of these calcium binding sites on the troponin complex. Since the first type of filament within a longitudinal fiber is the thin filament, you could probably guess what the next one is. It is a thick filament. Thick filaments are named of a material called myosin. In purple here, indicated with the red arrow, that is a thick filament within a myofibril as opposed to the yellow thin filaments here. And you can see how the thick filaments are thicker. Each of these myosin fibers has a head and a tail. So the head sticks out. You can see the heads right here. And the tails are all bound together into the backbone of that thick filament. Now, the actin is part of the cytoskeleton. The myosin is actually a movement protein within the cell. You don't need to know what else it does. It's not typically associated or I should say it's not typically found in fibers, but in the context of muscle cells, it is very carefully arranged into these fibers, these thick filaments within the myofibrils. Each thick filament is made up of approximately 350 myosin molecules. As usual, you're not going to need to know that number, but it's just good to know. There it is. It's about 350 per thick filament. So actin and myosin are not unique to muscle cells. They're present all over the body, but you find them best organized in a very orderly pattern, and it's that repeating pattern that provides the striped appearance that gives skeletal muscle its striped look and why it's sometimes called striated muscle. So you can see right here, this is a micrograph showing the orderly arrangement of these materials. Here we have the cartoon version, where you can see the thin and thick filaments overlapping, and here we have the micrograph showing the regions where it's just thin, and then the darker regions where both overlap. When you zoom out, this orderly appearance gives skeletal muscle its striated or striped appearance. This organizational unit within the myofibril is called the sarcomere. It's the basic contractile unit of skeletal muscle. It consists of overlapping regions of thin and thick filaments, and this is what is actually able to contract when a muscle contracts. In this figure, we can see the hierarchical organization of the muscle. So we have the muscle itself. Within that muscle, we have muscle fibers. And each of those muscle fibers, right here, this is a single muscle fiber or muscle cell. It contains many myofibrils, and each myofibril is hundreds or thousands of sarcomeres end to end. And each sarcomere contains thin filaments and thick filaments. So as far as muscle structure goes, I want you to know this hierarchy of muscle structure. Zooming in on sarcomere structure, we can see thin filaments made of actin in yellow right here, and thick filaments in purple made of myosin. The different regions of the sarcomere make up the rest of it. So at either end, we have the Z line, which is a layer of protein that the actin is embedded in. That is a stable structure. It does not move during muscle contraction, and that basically anchors the actin in place. The sarcomere spans from Z line to Z line. The region in between is a single sarcomere. In the middle, we have the M line. This is not a structure like the Z line. It's just a region in the middle where at rest there is no actin present. So it's where the myosin, the thick filaments, kind of line up, but it is not a physical structure. Think about it like the metaphase plate, and then it's a region where things are aligned, but it's not a physical thing that actually exists. It's just a region within the organization of the sarcomere. During muscle contraction, the way this works is the thin and thick filaments are going to slide past each other. They're going to increase the degree to which they overlap, and that's going to make the sarcomere shorter. The Z lines are going to move closer together. As this process is going on, the length of the filaments does not change. The thin filaments and the thick filaments stay the same size. They're just increasing the overlap. So you're starting like this, where they're not overlapped very much at all. And then as the muscle contracts, you increase the degree of overlap between the thick and thin filaments. Each sarcomere is only going to decrease by a little bit, but if you have thousands of them all in a row, that little bit of decrease from each one is going to contract that muscle. Here we can see this graphically. So on the left, we have a schematic version where you can see a relaxed muscle on top, a muscle in the process of contracting, and then a fully contracted sarcomere on the bottom. On the right, we can see the micrograph showing the same process. So these dark lines are the Z lines, and you can see that as the sarcomere contracts, the Z lines are going to get closer and closer together. Down here, it's much darker because everything is overlapping. There's no region in this completely contracted sarcomere where there are not thick filaments present. They span the whole length of the sarcomere when it is fully contracted. So we can see relaxed up here and fully contracted down here. Again, the thing that's happening is the fibers are overlapping. They start off like this and they end like this. You're not changing the length of any of the fibers within the sarcomere. You're just shortening the sarcomere by increasing the overlap. Now we'll talk about the mechanism of muscle contraction. This is called the sliding filament model. And it's called the sliding filament model because of what we just talked about. The filaments are sliding past each other. In order to make sense of this, we have to go back to our actin filaments first, our thin filaments, and look at how those different components are interacting. So at rest, the tropomyosin is covering the myosin binding site. So if we look right here, I described these monomers before as little Death Stars. Well, the little indentation on them, that is a binding site where the actin can bind to myosin. At rest, that is covered by tropomyosin, this gray fiber. So the actin and the myosin are unable to interact. If we're going to have a muscle contraction, the first thing we need to do is make sure that the muscle is coordinated. So the signal is going to come from a motor neuron, and that motor neuron is going to signal a motor unit. It's not going to signal one cell at a time. It's one single motor neuron with one action potential that is going to signal many muscle fibers at once. That is all called a motor unit. The reason we do it that way is so that it's much easier to coordinate the movement of lots of muscle cells simultaneously. You can have one single action potential getting hundreds of muscle fibers to contract simultaneously. Each junction between that motor neuron and the muscle is called a neuromuscular junction. That's just the axon terminal associated with the muscle. So in this figure, this green motor neuron associates with a number of muscle cells. Each of these synaptic junctions is called a neuromuscular junction. And within a motor unit, all of those cells are going to contract simultaneously. In order for a contraction to occur, an action potential reaches the axon terminal of the motor neuron, and that triggers the release of acetylcholine from that synapse. It binds to specific receptors in the muscle fiber, triggering a depolarization of that muscle fiber, specifically a depolarization of the plasma membrane. If this depolarization is strong enough, it will trigger an action potential in the muscle fiber. Now remember, muscle fibers are one of two types of excitable cells I mentioned a little while back. The other type that we've already gone into in detail are the neurons. So muscle fibers, in addition to neurons, are one of the types of cells in the body that is capable of rapidly changing its membrane potential. In other words, it can experience an action potential. So if that signal and if that depolarization from the motor neuron is strong enough, you will get an action potential in the muscle fiber, and that will lead to contraction of that cell. Now we have a problem here. The problem is that these cells are extremely large diameter. One thing we know about neurons is that the axons that are actually going to experience the action potential are extremely small diameter. So it doesn't take a whole lot of ions to diffuse through that structure very readily. That's not true for muscle fibers. Muscles are these big, large diameter cells. So we have a surface area to volume problem where we can't effectively depolarize that cell like we would an axon. The solution is something we talked about before. It's T-tubules. So what's going to happen here is we have a signal from a motor neuron that's going to release acetylcholine across the synapse and trigger a depolarization of that plasma membrane. That depolarization is not going to affect most of the muscle cell. It's only going to travel along the plasma membrane where you have voltage-gated ion channels. So it'll radiate along the surface, but it won't penetrate down into the cytoplasm because the volume is too great. But you still need to depolarize the inside of the cell. The solution to that is the T-tubules that I mentioned earlier. Those greatly increase the surface area of the muscle fibers and allow that action potential to penetrate deep into the cytoplasm. So in this figure right here, this big brick-like cell, that's your muscle fiber. Pretend it's a cylinder. These dotted lines indicate the kind of tunnels going through the cell from the T-tubules, and this blue part here represents the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which, as I said before, is closely associated with the T-tubules. That's really important because we need that action potential to travel along the T-tubules so it can interact with the SR, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When that signal goes down the T-tubules and interacts with the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that triggers the release of calcium. Basically, there are voltage-gated calcium channels there that are triggered when that action potential travels down that T-tubule. That releases calcium. So here's another example similar to something we saw when we looked at synaptic transmission where an action potential triggers the opening of voltage-gated calcium channels. We saw that at synapses previously, and now we're seeing it within muscle cells. So the calcium ions are released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm of these cells, which is largely full of myofibrils, and now we can start the process of contracting those fibers. The first thing that needs to actually occur during a contraction, and the actual steps of a contraction, is that calcium must bind to the troponin complex on the tropomyosin that's associated with those actin filaments. The reason is that that troponin complex is what regulates the ability of the thin fibers to associate with the thick filaments. Once calcium binds to the troponin complex, these purple things right here, it actually causes the whole tropomyosin to shift a little bit relative to the actin. So in the resting state, it's like this, where the myosin binding sites on the actin are blocked. And then in the presence of calcium, and these green circles represent calcium, in the presence of calcium bound to the troponin complex, everything shifts, and that exposes the myosin binding sites on those actin monomers. This means we can have an association between the thick and the thin filaments, and muscle contraction within that sarcomere can actually occur. Once we get to this stage, the contraction itself is a cyclical process. In this series of figures, we're going to see 4 stages here. So we have resting, and then we're going to kind of go around in a circle. So here is our resting state for our muscles. We have our thick filaments, we have our thin filaments, we have our myosin heads that are associated with an ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a single phosphate group. This is called the high energy state, meaning this is unstable. It represents potential energy. It's ready to go, but you can't do anything until those myosin binding sites are exposed. Once calcium is present and these binding sites are exposed, then you can form a cross bridge. So the tropomyosin shifts away from the binding sites, and you are able to form a cross bridge. Now the myosin head binds to the myosin binding site on the actin, and we have the cross bridge formed with the ADP and the inorganic phosphate still associated with that myosin head. The next step in the process is called the power stroke. This is where that ADP and phosphate break away from that myosin head. That causes it to shift from what's called the open conformation, which it is up here and down here, into the closed conformation down here. So you go from being like this, I don't know if you can see that, you go from being like this to being like that. Now the reason this causes the muscle to contract, this is when the shortening actually happens, because you're bound to the actin. And then when it shifts that actin relative to the myosin. The next step in the process is to associate with ATP. That causes a breaking of that cross bridge. So now the myosin head is in the closed conformation and it's bound to ATP rather than actin. It's not associated with actin in this state. It's let go. And we call this the low energy state because as far as the myosin is concerned, this is really nice and stable. The problem is ATP is not a low energy molecule, and ATP will spontaneously hydrolyze to ADP and inorganic phosphate. So the final step is that hydrolysis, which shifts the myosin head from the closed conformation back to the open conformation. Now it's got ADP associated with it. This is an unstable high energy state, and if the myosin binding sites are available, it will reach out and form another cross bridge. So in this way, you're going to have a cycle of very short changes in the location of the actin relative to the myosin. So each time it shifts it a little bit. And over thousands of these cycles, you're going to shorten that sarcomere, and that's how a muscle contraction works. So if my hand represents the myosin here, where this is the head of it, you start like this with ADP. You reach up and form a cross bridge. You do the power stroke. That's actually the shifting. That's the contracting step. Then you add ATP and let go. You hydrolyze the ATP and shift back. Now you want to grab back on. And that's what the cycle looks like over and over again. By the way, I apologize if my hand was out of frame for part of that. I'm trying to make it work, but yeah. So that's the process of a muscle contraction. The big thing I want you to get is each cycle costs 1 ATP. It starts with a high energy resting state where you have ADP bound to the myosin that forms a cross bridge as soon as the actin is available for binding. So once the tropomyosin shifts out of the way, that leads to the power stroke because this is still unstable. The way you make it more stable is by getting rid of the ATP, or the ADP rather. That leads to the power stroke, and that's where the actual shift takes place. And then you add another ATP to ultimately get back to your resting state via ATP hydrolysis. One more interesting note about this is there's a bit of a disconnect between where the energy is used and where the ATP is actually letting go of its energy. So what we have here in the low energy state, right, with all of our potential energy in this place is in the ATP. When the ATP hydrolyzes, it shifts the myosin into the high energy state. Now all the potential energy is in that high energy state, and that allows it to form the cross bridge and do the power stroke. At this point, we've discharged that potential energy. We've used the potential energy to accomplish that shift in position of the two fibers relative to each other, and then we can associate with another ATP, and now we're going to add more energy to the system to be able to do it again. The last thing we'll talk about here is where the energy for contraction comes from. Each myosin head can form about 5 cross bridges per second as long as there's enough ATP. If you do the math and think about how much ATP this adds up to, it's a lot, considering how many myosins are in each thick filament, how many thick filaments in each sarcomere, and so on all the way up. You only have enough ATP in your body for a few seconds of activity, basically. Each muscle only has enough ATP stored for a few seconds. Muscles also contain a material called creatine phosphate. This is a material that allows for the transfer of a phosphate back to an ADP to make an ATP. So basically you can recycle your adenosine diphosphate as you're going through this process. This is worth an additional 15 seconds or so of ATP, which means in total you're looking at 15 to 20 seconds of ATP stored in your muscles. Once you use that up, you need to be doing respiration to generate more ATP for additional contractions. The fuel to accomplish this additional cellular respiration is coming from glycogen, which is made of hundreds or thousands of glucose monomers. The main storage location for glycogen in your body is the liver, and we've talked about this in the context of blood glucose regulation. But the secondary storage location for glycogen in your body is skeletal muscle. So your skeletal muscles have a fair amount of short-term energy storage on hand in the form of glycogen. They can very rapidly break that down into hundreds and thousands of glucose monomers, which can then go through cellular respiration and generate a bunch of ATP relatively quickly. Funny historical note, most of you were not born when this happened, but in the 1998 Major League Baseball season, when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa were competing to beat Roger Maris's single-season home run record, there was a minor scandal when it was revealed that Mark McGwire used a workout supplement that involved creatine. It's creatine phosphate. It was not steroids. There were other problems with steroids at the time. Long story. If you want to get into the history of Major League Baseball, there was the steroid era back then, but this was not that. It's a different thing. So if you know your biology, you will better understand the 1998 season of Major League Baseball. So that's all we're going to talk about with skeletal muscle. In our next section, we are going to talk about the other two types of muscles in the human body.